He spent every night by his son's hospital bed praying for a miracle. Doctors had given up hope until a mysterious poor girl walked in and whispered something that shook him to his core. What she revealed changed his life and his son's fate forever. A heavy evening rain had washed the city clean, leaving the hospital windows glassy and cold. Miles Cadwell, a man whose name appeared on lists and headlines, sat motionless in a room that smelled of antiseptic and lost time. His face, usually composed and in control, had the helpless slackness of a man who had discovered a law that did not apply to him. Grief. On the bed, hooked to a chorus of machines, lay Jonah, his 16-year-old son, breath measured by digits and lights. Miles had built an empire from numbers and instincts. He had investors, yachts, and a reputation that bent the world to his will. Yet no skill, no fortune had prepared him for the quiet thunder of a son who could not wake. Days had become a rotation of consultants, monitors, and the polite distance of doctors who refused to promise miracles. Visitors dwindled, the staff rotated. The city outside carried on, unaware the billionaire's most private ledger was read. It was in this liminal fluorescent place that Anna arrived. She was small, with rain-dark hair and shoes that had seen better months. She carried no resume, no plea for money, no headline-grabbing sign. Instead, she carried a faded photograph folded twice inside her jacket, and eyes that had learned to hide whole oceans. She had been a stranger in the lobby when she saw the nurse enter with the boy's chart. Something in the name, Jonah, had hooked into a past she kept narrow and tidy. Anna had once known a boy with that name. She had not come for pity. She had come because an old promise, spoken in an alley years ago, pulls a person like a string through rain. Miles's assistant, a man named Carter, politely blocked her path. "Visiting hours are restricted," he said, balancing policy like an umbrella. "Please," Anna said, and there was a steadiness that made Carter's polite defenses look brittle. She carried the photograph out like an offering. A younger boy's fist tangled in a kite string, a scab on the knee, a grin that had no concern for calculations. Carter glanced, then, as if the floor had tilted, opened the door. They allowed her in. Anna approached the bed with a confidence born of familiarity with grief's geography. Miles watched her like a man at an auction watching a priceless object he could not place a value on. The machines hummed like distant traffic, indifferent, essential. Anna sat at the edge of the chair. She did not look at the monitors. She looked at Jonah and, with a voice that had the ease of a secret told often, said, "Turn off the machines. He will come out of the coma." The statement landed like a coin. Nurses laughed awkwardly as if humor were an appropriate response to magic. Carter's lips tightened. Miles, who had bargained and litigated, paid for impossibilities and manipulated outcomes, experienced a strange, unaccounted-for nuisance: doubt. "What do you mean?" he asked. It was the simplest and most expensive word a man like him could offer. Anna unfolded the photograph. Jonah's been missing pieces of himself. He remembers things that are not his. Sometimes he dreams of other rooms, other people. I used to trade stories with his mother, before the storms. And once I promised if either of us were ever lost, we would find our way back with whatever the other carried. She placed the photo on the bedside table as if placing a bridge. Miles's life had been guarded by lawyers and language. Anna's world had been guarded by survival and small, stubborn promises. Between them, Jonah breathed and the machines recorded the tedious triumph of numbers. But the idea of turning the machines off, the thought itself, exposed two kinds of courage. The courage to risk the measure and the courage to trust a narrative beyond charts. Anna explained that she had been a facilitator of sorts for the broken, an amateur listener and keeper of stories. She spoke of bedside rituals, words that had accompanied comas and woken relatives in places that didn't keep records. Her language was not medical. It was something older and thinner, stitched from lullabies, names, and the precise addressing of a soul. "It's not about the machines," she said softly. "It's about the story we give him to come back to." Miles felt the antibodies of skepticism rise. He had paid for studies, for neurologists who mapped synapses as if they were geographies to be privatized. But he also felt the raw ache of a father who would welcome a miracle even in installments. He asked for credentials with the same instinct a surgeon asks for a scalpel. Anna offered none. She offered a chair, a voice, and a photograph. The doctors were consulted. Legally and ethically, there was no basis for turning off life support against a family's wishes. The hospital contained more than machines. It contained forms, policies, and the careful coldness of printed consent. But the question lingered. If Jonah's body could be sustained indefinitely, what if his mind remained absent, locked in a lobby of memory where no keys fit? That night, after Carter had left and the monitors had become a constellation of small, dependable lights, Miles sat alone. He replayed the memory of Jonah as he remembered him. Scooter races, mischief, the summer Jonah had fallen for a comic book heroine. A father counts different kinds of wealth. He counted the small, messy repository of moments, and the calculus did not resolve. Anna returned each day, not as a supplicant, but as a steady presence. She read aloud from old letters she said Jonah's mother had kept. She hummed songs with keys at the edges of memory. The staff watched with polite detachment. Friends murmured. Investors politely phoned in concern for Miles's capacity to run a company, while his son lay in a liminal space. One evening, the corner of Jonah's mouth twitched. It was a sliver of movement, a tiny revolt against inertia. Miles realized that hope was not a straight line. It was a series of small, curious interruptions. Whether the twitch led to return or to an eventual exhale, no one could promise. Still, they all leaned toward action, toward anything that resembled choice. The days stretched like elastic. The press had its own rhythms, rumors drifted like leaves. Miles kept his public calm, statements, appearances, and an invisible cord that tethered him to the market. Yet under that calm was a relentless private work, learning to listen. Anna taught him rituals that had the rough honesty of strangers who'd learned too many ways to survive. They would walk the halls and name a scene, a park, a smell, a childhood joke, and then speak into the room as if Jonah could still read breath and tone. At first, Miles mimicked her. Then, gradually, he found his own voice, the weight of his words carrying memories he had not spoken aloud. At night, alone in the company's executive suite, he cataloged the ways his life could be rewritten. Money could pay for medicine, yes, but it could not buy back a childhood. Money could buy confession lines and apologies in glossy frames, but it could not reintroduce something Jonah never had the chance to finish. Anna, in turn, told him her story. A childhood spent moving from shelter to shelter, the small economies of kindness that kept people from vanishing. She had learned to listen to the cadence of people who had parted ways with their pasts. Sometimes a story, she said, is the door. Sometimes it's the light you turn on to see the door. You give him a reason to come back. The hospital staff grew curious. Volunteers appeared, some with faith and others with softer reasons. An interest in the human problem, a desire to do something meaningful. Their efforts became a mosaic: music, recorded voices, the laughter of friends. Miles watched, almost grief-struck by the ordinary tenderness of it. Then came a complication. A corporate board meeting summoned Miles. A rival whispered of instability. The market is a creature that feeds on certainty. It scalds those who show cracks. For Jonah, the timetable for any radical step was a lesson in how decision-making bends under pressure. Miles had to choose. Pursue an experimental procedure that might have marginal benefit, or pursue a path less quantifiable, one Anna seemed to represent, rooted in narrative and presence. The former would appease shareholders, the latter might elude the ledger but possibly unlock something that machines could not. He found himself negotiating not with lawyers but with meaning. He proposed a compromise, a controlled pause, not to abandon Jonah but to create a space where memory and presence could reassert themselves. Legal counsel balked. Ethicists called it reckless. Yet the idea had a strange logic. The body is sometimes kept in systemic stasis while the mind responds to its own logic. If Jonah was, as Anna insisted, waiting for a story that felt like home, then perhaps the story needed clean air to take root. One night, Miles and Anna stood by Jonah's bed as monitors clicked and recorded. "I will do this only with your consent," Anna said, though she had no legal standing. "You must decide if you want to risk numbers for the chance of a human answer." Miles signed the consent forms with a hand that trembled only once. It was the most expensive signature he had ever made. As the machines were calibrated for a temporary reduction, the staff watched like witnesses. The monitors, obedient to circuits and law, adjusted in quiet, responsible increments. What they had not accounted for was the weight of narrative pressing back, the patient force of memory. In those hours at the edge of clinical protocol, Miles felt the odd sensation of being both judge and supplicant. He wondered what his son would choose if he could. to stay in a silent, safe haven or to risk the uncertain light of coming back. There is arrogance in assuming what another would prefer. There is also a deep, unavoidable parental love that must decide. As the machines dimmed to a low hum, Jonah's chest rose and fell with a slower rhythm. A silence taut and electric settled. Nurses hovered and Anna began to speak, not in medical terms but in fragments. "Do you remember the comet? The way Jonah would chase fireflies? We are here." Within minutes, Jonah's brow creased as if listening to the sound of a distant bell. He turned very slightly, and the machine recorded a change. It was small, but it altered the trajectory of their waiting. The pause had become a hinge. They called in a neurologist who watched the scans with a professional curiosity that hid a human tremor. "It's premature to claim recovery," he warned. But incidents like this, micro-responses, are significant. The word significant became a beacon. Volunteers doubled down. Anna taught Miles how to be present without collapsing into theatrics. Miles taught Anna how to secure the room so that rests and rituals could occur. Word spread as word does. Some called Anna a charlatan, others called her a conduit. Miles's board called it a distraction. His heart called it a chance. Somewhere between headlines and whispered hospital hallways, Jonah lay poised on the edge of a decision he could not articulate. The following weeks were a blur of small mercies and large anxieties. Jonah's body began to show more signs of returning. A tighter fist, a blink that seemed to answer a name. Each movement produced a cycle: hope, analysis, caution. Miles oscillated between jubilation and a fear so sharp, it made him double-check security protocols he hadn't considered in years. But recovery is not a straight climb. As Jonah started to reclaim fragments, snatches of memory, the way to his favorite bench, the question of identity arrived like an overdue mail. Which memories belonged to him? Which belonged to the life that had brushed him? Anna whispered that memory is a communal act. Families, friends, and the stories we repeat become scaffolds for a self. If Jonah's memory had been shaped by absence, then their work was to shelter him with stories that would fit and nourish him. There were ruptures. A journalist caught wind of Anna's presence and painted her as an enigmatic figure. The article balanced skepticism with sensationalism. The public began to sketch their own narratives. A billionaire saved by a streetwise savant. A miracle worked by a woman who lived among the city's margins. The simplification irritated Miles. He wanted truth, not headlines, yet he also understood the leverage of narrative. Publicity could bring donations and support. It could also bring predators and complications. Jonah waking did not return like a switch being flipped. Some mornings he seemed lucid and then fell into confusion by the afternoon. The family, which had once been defined by shared dinners and scraped knees, had to relearn patience. Friends tried to be useful but often said the wrong thing. Miles discovered a humility he had not expected to inherit. The humility to ask for help and to accept it without making a spreadsheet. Slowly, Jonah began to anchor onto routines. He learned to eat with a fork again, to focus on the shape of a cup, to fold a napkin. These were small victories and they mattered. But the larger victory, that his heart would remember how to open to a father, was a different kind of work. Miles sat with Jonah, telling him stories of failure and folly, of the time he had lost the company a small fortune on a foolish bet and then got up. He wanted Jonah to know that imperfection did not preclude love. On an evening that smelled of rain and hot coffee, Jonah spoke a sentence that rattled the room. "Where's the kite?" It was a small request, but it carried an enormous geography. Hope, a path back. They found an old piece of paper and fashioned a kite. Jonah's hand was clumsy but intent. As he held the string, the room felt like something other than a clinic. It felt like a place where life could be rehearsed. Yet not all rehearsals are seamless. With recovery came memory collisions, false recognitions, and borrowed things. Some family members recoiled, unable to accept a son whose stories were stitched from strangers. Others, like Miles, chose to stay and help him assemble a self. The community around Jonah began to listen differently. Where they had once rushed past the homeless or the overlooked, they now paused, recognizing how much of a person is made of what others say about them. And then, like an echo returning from a distant canyon, the question of blame arrived. How had Jonah been hurt? There were lawsuits, whispers of a late-night accident, hints that the truth might be messier than anyone liked. As investigations began, Miles watched as his public and private lives braided into one another. Power can protect, but it can also blind. The narrative that rescued him might also threaten to expose him. Through it all, Anna remained a steady compass. She did not claim heroism. She only kept to the tedious work of story. "We do not fix what was broken," she told Miles. "We give it a place to live." And for the first time, Miles understood that certain riches are inside the human ledger. Patience, attention, the daily account of care. The last part of recovery is not a climax, but a series of small reconciliations. Jonah's speech returned in uneven phrases. His laughter was sometimes delayed, but he was present. Presence, they had discovered, is a radical form of grace. As the public attention ebbed and flowed, the private rituals persisted. Miles started coming to understand the paradox of power, that the ability to change things often requires the willingness to be changed in return. He began to spend mornings at the hospital, not because cameras might capture a headline, but because the quiet routines had become his anchor. Jonah began to make requests that were not just practical, but revealing. He wanted to visit a park he had not seen in months, to watch a pigeon feed, to sit on a bench and feel the texture of the world under his palms. These were ordinary acts that map a life. They were the small cartographies that stitched the mind to a present. Anna prepared to leave. Her work, she said, was done in the middle of other people's lives. She had never sought accolades. She had been the kind of person who moved through rooms, leaving them with slightly better air. Miles wanted to offer her money, a job, something that would keep her at his side. She declined. "Stories must be given, not bought," she told him. "If you want to keep one, tell it every day." There was one final reckoning. The investigation into Jonah's accident revealed that a hurried driver on a wet night had caused the crash. The driver was not wealthy and had not been malicious, just an ordinary mistake with extraordinary consequences. The family of the driver reached out, offering apologies and awkward tokens of compassion. Miles realized the world was threaded with delicate intersections, a life altered by error, a family attempting to repair what was fractured. Public opinion softened when the fuller truth came out. The headlines that had once speculated about miracles now balanced with reporting on accountability. Miles used his influence to set up a fund in Jonah's name for rehabilitation and for community initiatives that supported families dealing with trauma. It was not a solution in the abstract, but it was a form of restitution he could understand. For Jonah, readjustment continued. There were relapses, days of confusion, but the curve of his life had shifted. He learned to accept a new set of memories, some borrowed, some reclaimed, and build a sense of self from them. He returned to school slowly, sitting in the back of classrooms at first, then answering a question, then another. Anna visited now and then, always with a photo or a story fold tucked into her jacket. Each visit was like a punctuation mark in Jonah's narrative, and he started to recognize the cadence. His gratitude was small and immediate. A clear look, a hand that reached for hers. Miles watched, often in silence, learning not to measure everything in outcomes but to appreciate the incremental work of human repair. In time, the billionaire and the poor girl formed an unlikely friendship. Their differences remained. One had wealth that could buy recovery options, the other had a way of naming the world that made recovery possible. But in building a life around Jonah, they found common ground. The stubbornness to keep returning, the discipline of attention, and the courage to risk being wrong for the sake of love. On a bright afternoon, Jonah walked to the park with his father and Anna. He ran a short distance, laughter spilling out in a way that felt both new and familiar. He raised his face to the sky, and for a moment the world looked as if it had been reset. Not in a ledger, but in a human register. Miles would never be the same man who had controlled boardrooms with a flick of his pen. He had learned that some of the most important decisions do not present themselves with balance sheets. He now measured success by days of presence, by the number of breakfasts shared, and by the patience of a long, quiet vigil. Years later, when Jonah traced the edges of his past, he would find that many hands had steadied him. Some rich, some poor, all human. The truth had room for both pain and gratitude.